Did you know you actually only need 2 ingredients, just 2 ingredients, to make the best superfood for feeding your growing tomato plants? And one of those ingredients is water. So I'm going to give you my recipe and the super secret ingredient in a minute. But first I'm just going to tell you what we'll cover in the video. We'll cover why you need this superfood for your tomatoes, how to use it, in what ratios and quantities to use it, basically how you can use it for other plants as well. And I'll do a feeding schedule and some do's and don'ts. And I'll put all my workings out on my website as to why I worked out this was a great product for your tomato plants, so that you can satisfy yourself that I'm not just kind of making this up. I've actually put a bit of thought and work into the science of this. While I was thinking about this tomato feed, the main thing I was thinking was I don't want to put any of those chemicals on my garden. I've spent, however many years turning my garden into a mini nature reserve by going completely organic and being very careful about what I put in my garden. And of course, now that I'm growing more and more food crops as well, I just need to be even more careful, and I just don't want to put sort of chemicals on my garden. Last year I did a video on using bananas, etc., and making feeds in jars, and that was okay. But I think this way is much better, much more convenient, and even cheaper than the fertilizers I was using last year that I was fermenting in jars. The other thing is with this fertilizer is you don't have to have a compost heap, and you don't have to have a stinking compost tea in your garden. So it's great for people who have small spaces that they want to be able to feed, like maybe some plants in pots in a courtyard or on a balcony. This is perfect for that because you don't need extra space that you just haven't got just to make a bit of feed. But it does make one assumption. It does make the assumption that you might already have this product in your home. And if you don't, it's actually still really cheap to buy, and you can use it in other ways as well. All right, so let me just cut to the chase. The secret ingredient to feed your tomatoes and other plants with, and as I say, I'll give you a schedule of ways you can adapt it. I'll put that on my website to use to feed other plants. But it is passata, or even tinned tomatoes. Now, the only thing you have to make sure is that you don't have any salt or other ingredients in the tinned tomatoes or passata. So I have these 2 brands here. They are 100% tomatoes. The reason tomatoes are good for feeding tomatoes is because they're high in potassium. The reason they're high in potassium is because they've had to absorb potassium to make healthy fruits. Tomatoes draw the potassium, as much potassium as they can, out of the soil to create these big, rich, red, ripe fruits. So when you use a tomato product, because of the way tomatoes grow and the minerals they absorb, that the tomatoes are going to be full of potassium. So our growing tomatoes that we're growing in the garden need the potassium that those other tomatoes have already absorbed when they were growing. Because I'm constantly making tomato pasta sauce or a tomato soup, or I make, like my daughters came home from traveling and I made 2 different lasagnas because one of my daughters is vegetarian, the other daughter is not. And so I made these 2 different lasagnas which required a lot of passata. And I don't like to rinse the passata jar out and pour it into the sauce because it makes the sauce too watery. So I've got all this sort of passata sauce left. And the passata sauce is high in potassium. In fact, it has a great NPK. It also has nitrogen and phosphorus, but it has a greater quantity of potassium. So it got me thinking, well, if it's got potassium in it, why don't I just swill this out and feed my tomatoes with it? So I started to do a bit more research, and I was looking at how to obviously vary the quantities, because obviously this is quite an acidic product. So you don't want to overwhelm your plants with too much acidity. So you have to think about that. So the other thing I liked about it is because it either comes in a jar or in a tin, which means you're completely avoiding the plastics. And it literally says on the jar 100% tomato, so there's no dodgy chemicals in it. These are coming from Italy. We also know they're members of the EU, where they have very strict food standards. So I know this is a great product. Not only are we going to eat it, we can put it on our tomatoes, feed our tomatoes. And then I keep the jar for when I make my own passata when my tomatoes have ripened. So the life cycle of this jar of passata and my own tomatoes are just really neat. There's no waste product, there's nothing to go in the landfill. So I did have to do a bit of working out as to work out what what the quantities were, because as I say, you don't want too much of anything going on your tomatoes because that could have a negative effect. And with passata and tomatoes being quite acidic, as I said, you don't want to overfeed your tomatoes and you have all that acidity in the soil. So I did a lot more work, and as again, I'll put the workings out on my website. But basically there are like 3 ways you can use it. One is to basically just rinse out the jar and take your chances, fill the jar up with water, give it a bit of a swish, and then I poured that on my peas, for instance, or something, you know, your other fruits and vegetables. But if you want to be more scientific and have an actual feeding schedule and make sure you're not going to damage your plants, then I did work out that you need 50 to 70 millilitres per litre of water. So 50 to 70 millilitres of tomato or passata per litre of water. And this will give you the optimum parts per million of potassium that a young growing tomato plant needs to fruit healthily. And that is between 150 and 210 parts per million, which is the optimum range of potassium that the tomatoes need. And this is what your Tomato Right and all those other products that you would buy on the shelves, which are really expensive and you don't know what's in them, but that's the number they're shooting for. So when you're using your passata, you're getting the same result. Your tomatoes are getting the same potassium that they would if you were using an off-the-shelf tomato fertilizer. So I just used a litre bottle because that's easy. I could just measure out. So I had this left over from my cooking. I could just measure out exactly between 50 and 75 millilitres, and that gave me a second portion as well. So I had about 2 litres worth of water. My plants are only small. In fact, my plants don't technically need feeding yet, but for the purposes of this video, I did feed them anyway. And of course you can scale it up. So a 2-gallon bucket is 7.5 times that. So you do 7.5 times. So that's, I think, it worked out about half a bottle of passata. Well, bear in mind this passata, which is organic and 100% tomato, is like £1.49 in Home Bargain. So it's an awful lot cheaper than the tomato fertilizers you can buy in the shops. And of course, the main thing is you know what you're getting. You're getting a healthy product that you can eat. You know, you're not going to be poisoned. Your kids aren't going to be poisoned. Your pets aren't going to be poisoned. And your tomatoes aren't going to be poisoned. And you didn't buy any harmful plastics that you can't reuse because you don't know what ingredients were in that product. So then you would feed, with this feed, you can feed your tomatoes between every sort of 7 to 10 days. Really, you want to start feeding about the time the first flower appears, or around the time you're getting the first bud. That's when you start to feed, and then you take on that feeding schedule of 7 to 10 days. In this demonstration that I'm showing you here, these tomatoes are far too young really for me to be feeding, but I've done it for demonstration purposes. But really you want to be doing it when the yellow flower or the bud starts to appear. And last year I did a video on how I drip fed my tomatoes so that I could go away and forget about them for the weekend. And that was an upturned bottle in the soil that I poured water in. And that successfully drip fed the tomatoes and kept them moist for a couple of days without me having to rewater. So I mean, the ideal thing is to carry on with this system, but to fill it up with the passata water that I made. And then that'll be not only drip watering it, but also drip feeding it. So it's just going to be the absolute perfect solution. So then there are some do's and don'ts. And as I said, I'm going to put more information on my website so that this video doesn't go on too long. But there are some do's and don'ts. And the don'ts are, don't overfeed with the passata, because it's a very acidic product. So you don't want to turn the soil acid because the tomatoes won't like that. You also don't want to pour it on the leaves. So just feed onto the base of the soil, around the base of the tomato. And that's why the drip feed is really good as well, because that feeds right down into the roots, because you don't want any harmful bacteria on the leaves of your plant. Depending on how fine the holes are of your rose or your water bottle, I put some holes in the cap here. As the feed got to the end, there was a little bit of flesh that did block up the holes, which I just had to rinse out. So just be mindful of that. I suppose you could sieve it, but really it's not that big of a deal to just have to rinse out the holes. And then I just poured the flesh onto the surface of the soil. As I said, it can be varied to use on different plants such as sweet peas, roses, aubergines, cucumbers, etc. And really that's it. So if you found the video helpful and you think you're going to give it a go, don't forget to subscribe and comment and like, and also visit my website at www.chillbrotherton.com. Thanks for watching. Bye.